All right, any questions? Anything I can answer? So today will be actually, I guess, an old school lecture, which, is there a mic or just is there an echo? My voice is empowering. The old woman in the meeting, I was just thinking would talk a little louder. She could use a mic. All right, so today I'll just be focusing in on two specific questions that are in the Exam 2 review guide. I just added those. So these, just the whole focus is that. And so as you go through, and take notes, do whatever you do, just kind of keep in mind we've got two big questions, and that's what we're answering. And you'll see this will all be very maybe organized in a way that you'll understand where, what we're talking about and how that relates to each of the specific questions. The person I was made this slide for isn't here, but this was just kind of once again emphasizing the confusion between scale and aggregation. So think of this as scale. Once again, we zoom in. So scale, we zoom in, the same county, same map is being used, we're just zooming in, so we're changing the scale. So now we're looking at the more, obviously, of a regional scale instead of a country or continent-wide scale. Whereas aggregation is, we change the data, the geography. Now we're looking at counties, change it to states. Notice I didn't zoom in, zoom out, just change the data. So just once again, wanting to emphasize that here at the beginning. I've mentioned some things this semester. Kind of the idea here is, how cool is it that you lived during this time? What are some of those things I mentioned?
Technology.
Technology, okay, but these major events, major changes, major things that throughout human history. The 20th century, we talked about that, the most dynamic population century will ever be, and you were born during it. I hope you're all 20th century. The other one, 2007, was the first time in human history more people lived in urban areas than rural areas. Throughout the whole entire human history, it's the first time we now have a majority urban dwellers compared to rural dwellers. Well, guess what? We just have a new statistic that just came out. On October 1st, became the first day in human history, global life expectancy has reached 60 years old. Now, we all here in the United States, 70s, 80s is on average the global life expectancy, or our life expectancy here, but globally it's now surpassed 60. Where am I getting that information from? A supranational organization called the World Health Organization. And so this data isn't just me making up stuff. This comes from a big, huge organization, one of those supranational organizations. Nothing important for a lecture, nothing important for a future exam, but nonetheless, changes are occurring, transitions are happening, which is going to be a key thing we're going to talk about today. So the question I'm going to be first off answering is this question here. And once again, this is copy and pasted straight from the Exam 2 review guide. So once again, this is the only time I'm going to talk about this question. I guess I can talk about the Exam 2 review session in a future Wednesday. But this isn't found in any text. Obviously, we screwed that one up. As far as this chapter, there's no text for Chapter 7, this week's chapter. If you haven't gotten that message, if you're confused, come down afterwards and I'll explain it to you. But I'm just going to be answering this question here. Describe the key differences between an endemic, an epidemic, and a pandemic, and also include specific examples of each. And so there's no doubt that you'll see specific examples. And so going forward for a future exam, you can use those examples, but of course there's tons of diseases. If there's one that you know really well, then go ahead and make sure, use that. So these, don't think that your examples have to be explicitly mine, but nonetheless I'm going to provide, hopefully, different ways to understand these different ideas. And so this is going to be, I guess I can read off the notes, but let's go through this individually. Oh, we're getting cut off, aren't we? Oh well, we can work with it. So what we have over here, endemic. So endemic, the key word is maintained within a population. So an endemic disease is maintained within a population. That could be a population as far as a group of people, young people, old people, white people, black people, green people, or it could be maintained within a specific geographic area. Africa, North America, Indiana, rural areas. And so endemic diseases, keyword though, maintained. Not really seeing many changes. They're always kind of there. We always kind of find them. Really not changing, not increasing, not really decreasing. They're always pretty much just there, maintained, constantly there, within a small group or a specific area. Chickenpox. How is that an example of an endemic disease? People in Asia have, chickenpox. People in, Indiana have chickenpox. How is chickenpox an example of an endemic? What group might it be endemic to? Chickenpox. Who?
Children.
Children. Raise your hand if you got chickenpox. So only one person? Two people? The more people have but chickenpox is something that old people don't get. Children get. So chickenpox is endemic to young people. Sickle cell anemia. Who's that endemic to? Anybody know?
Africa, that kind of like swamp area.
African Americans, black people. People of African origins. So people of African origins, so in the United States, African Americans are, as far as them, the endemic group for sickle cell anemia. Cholera, malaria, yellow fever. I'll show you via my maps where those are endemic to. So those are going to be geographic endemic. So once again, endemic maintained within a certain population. Chickenpox maintained within young people. And we can come up with all kinds of examples. Alzheimer's, old people would be an example. And you can try to come up with more. As far as different groups in which diseases are endemic to. Like I said, cholera, malaria, yellow fever. Maps will show where those are endemic to. Next up we go with epidemic. So I'm also explaining this because these are often confused terms. Epidemic, the key word, spreads. So here we see changes. So if all of a sudden you see, in 2000, this disease was only found, just a little bit, and then in 2012 it's all over the place, that's an epidemic. It's spread over a larger region. How is the flu? How is that an epidemic? Flu, how is that an epidemic?
Because it's always changing.
It's changing when?
With the season.
Seasons. And so the flu becomes an epidemic in the wintertime. So that's why we all have to go out and get our flu shots. And we're getting the emails, reminder, get your flu shots. We don't get that in spring. We don't get that in summer. We get that in the fall because influenza becomes an epidemic during the winter months. So we can go, as far as explain why, just the winter and in the summer, but the main idea here is people are in closed areas, inside, and flu is a contagious diffusion, and contagious in which it spreads from person to person. So when we're all, cooped up in the same areas, indoor areas, we're more likely to share it with each other. Diabetes in the United States. Diabetes in the United States, it's something we find it everywhere in the United States. Doesn't matter if it's New York, Connecticut, California, but the idea here is it's increasing. It's spreading. And I got maps to showcase this. So diabetes in the United States, along with obesity in the United States, is something that's increasing. So when we think of increasing, spreading, and so sometimes that word rapidly is included with epidemics, doesn't have to always be, but we'll have other examples to showcase an epidemic. Finally, pandemic. So pandemic becomes global. More than two or more continents, you can find that disease prevalent. Pandemics. We could say AIDS is a pandemic. AIDS is found everywhere. Now, certain areas have more AIDS than other areas, but AIDS is found in every continent. We could also say swine flu, H1N1, which I bring that up because it was in 2009. Some of you maybe remember that 6 years ago. That became a pandemic. But Ebola, question mark, Ebola. Is it a pandemic? It's hard to say. Right now, definitely not. But last year, when you had people in Europe, you had people in North America, you had people in the United States, you had people in Asia, China, India, when they became infected with Ebola, it becomes a pandemic. So another thing to think about is how diseases can kind of change their categories over time. But some of them are obviously going to be one or the other. So something to keep in mind. And so now we've got various maps to showcase these different types. I'm going to work with them in order. So start off with endemic diseases to help showcase this definition. So obviously very simple definitions. So when you explain the key differences, be able to distinguish those definitions that are obviously very simple, but also be able to provide specific examples to showcase you understand each of those. First off, this is death from vitamin A deficiency. And so once again, this is our proportional symbol map, and you can see, I know if you know your world geography, you can see Western Hemisphere, vitamin A deficiency, it ain't a problem. Africa, yeah, you bet your bottom dollar it is. Also South Asia, Central Asia, so you could say vitamin A deficiency is endemic to Africa, but also South Central Asia. But you don't find it on every continent. Especially you don't even find it anywhere really in the Western Hemisphere. Now let's look at cholera. This is cholera. Outbreaks of cholera. Cholera is an infectious disease. It's a disease that you acquire through body waste, essentially. So this cholera, it's endemic to, once again, Central Africa, but also more tropical areas. You can see a little bit there in the Caribbean. So you get to say tropical areas. The cholera is endemic to. So you can see that based on geography. So not only do we have chickenpox amongst groups, but also geography, we can see that as well. This is malaria. What is malaria? How do you get malaria?
Mosquitoes.
Mosquito bites. So why are there no mosquito bites in Russia?
It's too cold.
It's too darn cold. And so we can also see how the physical geography, the weather, climate. So malaria is something in which it's an infectious disease. It's from mosquitoes. Mosquitoes bite humans, and that's how they get that particular disease. And so endemic, it's endemic to tropical areas. That makes sense. But, Florida's tropical. New Orleans is tropical. I don't know if you've ever been down there. They got palm trees. So also what's going on here is also the technology to fight off malaria. Malaria was a big problem in the 1950s in the United States. Now, you hardly ever find cases of it. Go to Africa, it's still a huge problem. So people actually have to sleep inside nets so that they don't get those mosquitoes, coming out and biting them when they're sleeping. So you can actually see this if you visit Africa. Certain parts where this is really at its worst. Further, yellow fever. Yellow fever is another example. You kind of have this tropical pattern going on. Another example of an endemic disease, and it's endemic to tropical areas. Let's go to the United States and see if we can find anything endemic here. So at the top, we got lung cancers on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, it's essentially skin cancer. So can we say that one or the other, maybe both, are they endemic to certain areas, geographic areas of the United States? So if you don't know how to read a map, navy blue or dark blue, high cases, whereas green, hardly any. And so lung cancer, is it endemic to certain areas, could we say? Where?
Midwest.
Midwest, kind of wherever the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, kind of this particular area. I don't know what to call it. We can kind of say the Midwest, kind of the South, all that area. We'll call it the Mississippi Valley. That sounds good. But nonetheless, this map reveals that people have much higher rates of cancer in these particular areas. And why does this matter? For stuff we will never talk about. But if you're specializing in lung cancer research, it would make sense to open up a facility somewhere down there compared to Utah or Nevada. Nevada? I wonder why Nevada. Maybe it's no data. Because all those people are smoking with their prostitutes and their gambling. If you're going to have one vice, might as well use them all. But anyway, let's look at skin cancers. Skin cancers, is that endemic to a certain area? What do you think?
To the northwest.
Yeah, it's in general just northern areas. So that also makes sense. People go down to Florida, they get sunburn, They go out there, their skin, which was previously like mine normally is pasty white, and they go down there and it becomes, bright red, then they pick up melanoma, skin cancer. So also what you have is you have a lot of African Americans that live in this particular area as well. So that also is another kind of overlap as well. We could also, this is kind of, I guess, endemic. I just found this data, found this interesting. Pine Ridge is a Native American reservation. I want to talk about all kinds of groups. And so Native Americans. And so this Native American reservation, this is the data for it, compared to the U.S. average. So this Native American reservation, and we could say more broadly, in general, Native American groups throughout much of the United States have higher rates of liver disease. Look at that, 121 to 9.7. Higher rates of suicide, 37.2 to 10.9. So here you see higher alcohol rates, higher than subsequently liver disease rates, but also higher rates of depression, higher rates of suicide, and so you could say those factors together are endemic to Native American groups compared to the general U.S. population. So once again, using these terms to just explain different things. Obesity in the United States. So what this is measuring average weight in pounds, both sexes combined, 2012. So the average Asian is 127 pounds. The world average Earthling, 136 pounds. Obesity, is it endemic to the United States? I would say yes. I mean, compared to the other areas of the world, much higher obesity rates here in the United States. This is something that's just not a United States thing. It's something that's actually growing. So as we go every year, not only are we moving to urban areas, but we're also, the average Earthling is gaining weight. So we could say obesity is also an epidemic. Because it's increasing, it's spreading. And so here's bar graphs to showcase this. This is the prevalence of obese children, so childhood obesity, a major problem in the world, but also in the United States, over time. And so we can see 1990 to 2012, globally, childhood obesity is increasing. And so it's becoming an epidemic. It's changing. We're seeing a growth, a spread, as far as the people who have childhood obesity. Let's look at another bar graph. And so 2000 is the maroon, 2012 is that taupey pukey color. So 2000, so just let's try to see if we can see, are there anything that's spreading? Is there anything that's increasing?
Heart problems. We see the
Heart disease, increasing. We see a 16% increase. So heart disease, cardiovascular disease is something that's becoming globally an epidemic. We're seeing it spread through, to more areas of the world. It used to be more developed countries, stage 4 demographic transition model countries, but it's changing. So also related to that, stroke. But also how, this is depressing topics. This is all about how we die. But road injury. What might be causing road injury to increase?
technology.
Texting drivers, is that what it is?
I don't know. It's pretty sure.
It could be. I would argue it is, but that's a whole other thing. More people drive cars. We have more people driving. That's why Ford, Chevy, they love Asia right now. They love Malaysia, China, because there's people buying cars for the first time ever. More and more people buying cars. Oh, they love it. United States, we're kind of an old market. I mean, actually, people are buying less cars as they become more efficient. People use Uber and these electric cars and all of that. So globally, in certain areas where you're seeing an increase in injuries from traffic fatalities. This is another one. I wish I could show the whole thing, but this is the spread of diabetes. So essentially the idea here is the scale doesn't change, but the years do. So orange is high rates of diabetes. So over 10%. You can see hardly any orange in that's 1995. Hardly any in 2000, but it's increasing. 2005, it's spreading. 2010, and I guarantee by 2015, we're going to see a whole lot more orange in this map. So diabetes is something that's increasing. The data shows that. It's spreading. It's rapidly increasing throughout much of the country. So it's not just specific areas. Or is it? Do we find diabetes more likely in certain areas? So we can say, once again, we can use terms, we can use them in multiple ways, just how we use them. We can say that diabetes currently is an epidemic. It's spreading throughout the country. But if we look at it just in one snapshot, in one moment of time, you could also kind of say it is kind of endemic to the south here. So it's an epidemic, it's spreading, but if we look at it, where do we find diabetes most likely in the United States? Somewhere in this particular area. So this is the south. And so it relates to income level, it relates to education level. You find higher education levels towards the coast. In this area here, got these overlapping factors, higher obesity rates. In the south, do they fry their food? In the south, do they fry their food? They fry everything. Tomatoes, okra, steak, chicken, obviously we all eat fried chicken. They fry everything. And so their health, their diet also relates to the higher rate of diabetes. So here we have tuberculosis. And so tuberculosis, to kind of come back to this, so we talked about endemic diseases. We've talked about epidemics. In terms of tuberculosis, my grandfather, he died of tuberculosis here in the United States in the 1950s, or 1960-something. So the United States, we could say, it was heavily affected by tuberculosis, but really no one really dies of tuberculosis in the United States anymore. So what we have here is we have tuberculosis, or TB, to shorten it, essentially was something that became a pandemic. Everywhere across the world you find it. But what's happening now is it's actually receding. So it's an example of a receding pandemic. Something which was found globally and which is essentially receding. And essentially what's happened is it's becoming increasingly endemic to, once again, some of those key areas. So once again, we can relate this to income level, development, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America in which we see higher rates of tuberculosis. So it's something which was a pandemic, which is essentially receding and now coming back into endemic areas. So tuberculosis is an example of a receding pandemic. Next up is the old H1N1, swine flu. So countries that are black are places in which they have the presence of H1N1, swine flu, back in 2009. So this is 2009. Countries that are black is where it was found. Countries where it's red, they think it's found. Countries where it's white or gray, either no data or there's no presence of H1N1 swine flu in those particular countries. And so this is definitely, we could say, a pandemic. It's found across the world. But anybody, are you an expert on it? It sounds like you know all your diseases. You know your swine flu?
I don't.
You don't know your swine flu. Does anybody know their swine flu? Swine flu. Swine flu is essentially something that started in Mexico. So they actually found the origins for this global pandemic with some farmer in Mexico. So essentially it went from animal to human. So in this one small area, then it rapidly spread, became an epidemic, and then globally became a pandemic. But if we think about diffusion, we think about, why are certain areas in this map colored and other maps aren't, or other areas not? So why might Africa and remote Russia, why would they be less likely to be affected by swine flu?
What is transportation there?
Then we can go to network diffusion. We can also kind of relate that to hierarchical diffusion. So networks and hierarchies kind of go together. We think about airports. Airports are in big cities. Roads are found in populated areas. So the further you are, the more remote you are, the more off the grid, the less connected to the global network of transportation, you can see the influence of that. And so oftentimes you'll see our lower income or developing countries, places that are on the negative side of the digital divide, would say, actually benefiting because they're not coming in contact with those certain diseases which are being spread and transported via airline networks in big cities and all of that. So we think about Ebola. Do we remember where the Ebola patients in the United States were? Remember where they were?
New York.
New York. Big city or small city?
Big.
Okay. Another one. There's like three, I think.
Is there one in Texas?
Dallas, Texas. And so another big city. And the third one, Atlanta. So obviously they were taken to specific places, places that could handle, and these are actually Americans that had Ebola in West Africa, but so that they helped them, they brought them to the hospitals here in the United States to help them, and that's of course where you couldn't interact with them and all that stuff if you remember Ebola It was a big news story a year ago. So let's talk about AIDS. So AIDS, HIV, is it a pandemic? Yes, it's found everywhere. So it doesn't matter where you are. Of course, there's certain areas where it's found more than not, particularly in southern Africa is where HIV still is a big problem. But Scott County, Indiana, far removed from South Central Africa, also HIV. So it's found everywhere. So it's a pandemic. Maybe it's receding. I haven't really kept up on my AIDS over time. I think it would be, but it's something which it's definitely found everywhere. When was the first human with Ebola reported? Let's see if we can find out from this video that's less than 2 minutes, or maybe 2 minutes. Will it work? No, it won't. See? What do I do? The experts on? What do I do? Oh, it's such a good video. So good. Oh. (1976). So Ebola, 2014. It was the news story of the year. It's been around since 1976. So essentially, we can use these terms, endemic, epidemic, and pandemic, to describe Ebola over time. So Ebola comes from, there's different theories. An old theory was that, and it comes from one particular area, a country in Africa called Guinea. Is that, am I pronouncing that right, Sam?
Yeah.
Guinea? Guinea. Where are we at on the map? Professional geographer here. I should know my Guinea. There it is, right here. So there's this one town. Let's go ahead and try to pronounce the town. Guayaquil. Does that sound about right? Sure. But Guayaquil, whatever. This town in this really remote village in Guinea, Africa. Essentially, the people there, they eat bats. Sounds weird, but it's what they eat. They probably think it's weird that people eat fried tomatoes in the South. But anyway, they eat bats. So they think that what happened was people ingested the bat that was infected. And so this is something that in this particular village, this remote area of Guinea, Ebola's been around since 1976. And so essentially Ebola is endemic to very remote areas in particular specific parts of Western Africa. Then over time though, so this video really does a good job of showcasing how over time people from that village migrate to other areas, they move to cities, they move to urban areas. We talk about as far as the transition model, people move to cities more than ever, and so people start migrating, and so you start getting contagious diffusion as well, and so it starts to spread throughout Africa, and then it becomes a pandemic. So they step back, it starts to spread throughout Africa, it becomes an epidemic because it's spreading throughout everywhere. So we saw Democratic Republic of the Congo. Nigeria, did they have much? No, I don't think any cases, which was really interesting. So they were actually pretty effective as far as preventing the disease from getting to Nigeria, which is, right, I mean, do you share a border with Guinea? No. See, I don't know my jargon, I'm horrible. Liberia, right here, Liberia, Guinea, huge as far as the Ebola disease. Huge numbers of cases, which the video is called "How This Ebola Outbreak Became the Worst Ever Seen." It's by Vox, V-O-X. Anyway, and so let's take a look at Ebola. We can see how it has this endemic area. It then became an epidemic as it spread throughout much of Africa. But then over time becoming a pandemic. When you see it in Europe, you saw it in the United States. but also there in Asia. So example of a endemic that became an epidemic, which then became a pandemic, and probably now is back to being something we only really find there in Central Africa. Any questions to that question? Anything you want me to explain? Another example? Anything you want to talk about? Yeah.
One thing I find really interesting is the summer of 2009, my family and I went to Mexico. And before we left, we were advised by doctors and friends and family, don't go there, swine flu this, swine flu that. Get these shots, get that. And it was just crazy. And when we got there, no one knew what we were talking about.
Huh. Yeah.
No idea what we were talking about. I don't know if that was the media, if there were really that many cases. We were in Mexico City.
Yep. I would think that that's tied into the digital divide. So this kind of access to knowledge. And so here, for better or for worse, our media controls so much of what we do. We know what the media is disseminating information to us all the time. But rural parts of Mexico, rural parts of Belize, or just the average people. I mean, in those countries, they might not be getting news every second. They don't have Twitter telling them, oh my gosh, there's all these horrible things happening. Oh my gosh, doctors telling you, warning you, having that close relationship with the doctor that they would be, that they tell you, hey, don't go, you shouldn't go. Yeah. And so I think that definitely ties in to those bigger ideas as far as this knowledge and information, access to it. Anything else with that? Right on. All right, so the next question. The next question is to describe the epidemiologic transition model. So this is, once again, if you master the demographic transition model, which I think a lot of you did from the exams, it looks like it. So if you master the demographic transition model, this should make a lot of sense. So the epidemiologic transition model also overlaps with the demographic transition model. But just like the demographic transition model, there are exceptions. But this, in general, explains most of the situation we find in the world. That's kind of the case of the model. The model doesn't always explain everything, but it does a good job of providing us a basis, kind of a snapshot of what's going on. So let's talk about it. So first off, we have to know our different diseases. We got two different types. On the left-hand side, we got infectious diseases. These are also known as, or AKA, communicable diseases. So communicable diseases, infectious diseases, they go hand in hand. They're synonyms. Also, contagious diseases is also kind of how they're referred to. Parasitic, you might also see. And so as the name, we know what contagious means, obviously. So infectious diseases are one in which it goes from mosquito to human, pig, i.e. swine, to human, bats to humans, or humans to humans. Flu. We spread the flu via human to human. AIDS, HIV/AIDS, sexually transmitted diseases. I can't get a better example of a contagious disease that's spread from person to person than sexually transmitted diseases. Diarrhea. Diarrhea is something that I used to say, and people still laugh. But diarrhea, people die of diarrhea. So diarrhea, could be from food, could be from water. Oftentimes it's from water throughout the world. So something we take for granted here is clean drinking water. In other parts of the world, no, it's still a major issue. It's something simple. So that's something simple that I think we're going to be able to help solve in the next 10 years is a major issue throughout the world as far as poor drinking water. Lower respiratory infections, flu, pneumonia. I guess pneumonia, but flu is just an example of that. To put that in context. So we got those types, and then of course we got the opposite, the inverse of all of that. And that's non-infectious diseases. That's what it says at the top, non-infectious diseases, which are also known as non-communicable. Other terms you might hear, chronic, not that kind of chronic. Genetic. So my father, bless him, thank you so much, Father, for giving me a bad heart. So in my family, heart disease is genetic. Everyone's got a problem. It doesn't matter if you're healthy. It doesn't matter if you're like my dad, preparing for a marathon. He had a massive heart attack. So genetic. Degenerative diseases, they're also known as. Degenerative diseases examples would be Alzheimer's, dementia, just things over time when old people are more likely to get because your body starts breaking down. So you're not dying or you're not becoming ill from infectious diseases, you're dying just because your body breaking down. Cancers, cup cancer, as I always say. And different types of lung disease, chronic lung diseases, black lung disease, lung cancer, of course. And so I talked about these two because, once again, we could overlap the demographic transition model. And so over time, countries, places of the world, throughout human history or to this day, transition from non-infectious diseases being what kills most people to, infectious diseases being what kills people to non-infectious diseases killing people. So United States, stage 4 countries, these are what kills people. Whereas in stage 2 countries, stage 3 countries, these are still a big problem. Now I'll come back and clean that up a bit throughout this discussion. So once again, infectious diseases, also referred to as communicable, or contagious or parasitic. And these examples, HIV/AIDS, diarrhea, malaria, TB. And over here, non-infectious diseases, also referred to as communicable, also referred to as chronic, genetic, degenerative, not contagious, and examples being heart disease, lung cancer, pancreatic cancer, liver cancer, bone cancer. The worst one, pediatric cancer. That's the worst. Yeah.
What's the parasitic?
Parasitic. Think of that as insect. So for example, malaria. So that's the parasite bites the host. So we think of us as the host. So parasitic are, typically we think of those as related to insects, mosquitoes, but it could also be, all kinds of weird worms. I got all kinds of gross pictures that could show of various examples of parasitic diseases, but they're where it's a non-human infects a human. Yeah, I'm hungry. All right, and so what this shows is change. So what we've got here, I know you can't see, so the red are communicable, the blue are non-communicable. So in other words, the red are infectious diseases, and the blue, the dark blue, is non-infectious diseases. The light blue is injuries. So the moral of the story is what? We can see from this pie chart, over time, what's happening in the world. So once again, red, non-infectious diseases. Dark blue, let me step back. I'm all over. Red is infectious diseases. Blue is non-infectious diseases.
Non-infectious diseases are prevailing?
Growing, increasing. Or we could say the inverse of that, we're seeing less infectious disease as far as the world pie, looking at that chart. Another way to showcase this is, do we see more red lines going down than blue lines? Yeah. And so that just moral of the story here is infectious diseases are going down. We're seeing less of them. The blue lines, we're seeing more incidences of those non-infectious diseases, genetic, chronic, all those other ways in which we die. And so here's ways we can showcase this. And so once again, I've yet to talk about the economy. But if you haven't picked up on this yet, stage 2, early stage 3 countries, low income. Stage 3 countries, middle income. Stage 4 countries, high income. And so once again, we can see overlaps here. So these are the World Health Organization, different income groups. Let's see, let's identify 3 things. We got a smart group on our hands today. Let's make 3 comments, 3 observations about this data. Let's make 3 observations about this data. Different income groups, communicable, non-communicable, or in other words, infectious, non-infectious. And what that is the proportion of the deaths that are non-communicable. So the proportion of the deaths overall in the country that are from non-infectious, chronic, degenerative. Let's make 3 observations. Yeah. Observation number 1.
The communicable deaths, they have the low income in 2012. They have a very high communicable debt.
Yeah. Okay, so observation number 1. Lower income countries have higher rates of communicable diseases compared to higher income countries. So that's our first observation we can see. We can see that just in this column right here. A second comment we can make.
Both low income have relatively high, like both communicable and non-communicable.
So let's take that one step further. So essentially, in lower income countries, you're just more likely to die. And so we can see that in both cases. Whether it be communicable or non-communicable, in both instances, they have higher death rates. And so if you go look at their population geography or their data, if you go look at their demographic indicators, their death rates are going to be much higher than stage 4 high-income countries. And so we can say with low-income countries, both communicable and non-communicable, you can find high rates of them. But when we look at the proportion, though, of the overall deaths in those groups that are from non-communicable, we can make our third observation here. So in high-income countries, you're more likely to die from non-infectious diseases, degenerative diseases, non-communicable diseases, as you can see, a much higher percentage than in lower-income countries. And so just once again, our 3 observations. Lower the income, higher the number of communicable deaths. Also, we could say the lower the income, also the higher number of non-communicable deaths. Just essentially a higher number of deaths for lower income areas compared to higher income. But once again, if we look at within those groups, proportion, 397 from non-communicable, only 34 from infectious. We can see a much higher percentage in those high-income countries. Further, we can look at specific infectious diseases, so cholera, malaria, tuberculosis, yellow fever, or AIDS. It doesn't matter. In all of those, the higher the income, the less likelihood of having those infectious diseases. But that makes sense. In high-income countries, we're more likely to have, are more likely to die from communicable diseases, and that's related to all kinds of factors we've mentioned beforehand, but also some things we haven't mentioned. And money is the big one. Money is powerful. And so here we have the demographic transition model. So I'm not going to explain that anymore, put that to bed, but we can kind of just go ahead and call this the epidemiologic transition model as well. So let's go through each of these stages. So let's start off with stage 1. So once again, kind of going back to the demographic transition model throughout much of our history, we're hunters and gatherers. We were always on the move. High birth rates, high death rates. And so here, what was the big problem? Infectious diseases overwhelmingly was what killed people. Diabetes, Alzheimer's, not a problem back then. Also, the average life expectancy, we're talking, in the 20s. So infectious diseases, epidemics, pandemics, people dying of hunger, famine, but also violent deaths as you compete with others, but also woolly mammoths, all kinds of various animals and stuff that you're fighting off that are killing you. And so essentially a lot of violent deaths as well. So people dying of violent deaths, but also a lot of infectious diseases. So that's stage 1. Once again, we were much more likely to be hunters and gatherers. Let's talk about obesity. During the hunters and gatherers era, what do you think? Were we fat? Were we thin? What did we look like? The average earthling during the hunters and gatherers era.
Husky.
Huh?
Husky.
Husky?
A lot of muscle.
A lot of muscle. So there's this new diet, the paleo diet. I don't know if you've heard about it. The paleo is a whole, it's an old historic time. So essentially what we're doing is we're back then eating a diet that wasn't high in sugars, wasn't high in fats. It was, a lot of fiber, meats, a lot of vegetables. So it wasn't a diverse diet, but it was we were much leaner. We weren't eating foods high in fats, high in sugars, and all of that. Also, hunters and gatherers, you're always on the move. So we talk about not only we're having a low-carb diet, but we're also always on the move. And so if you look at a lot of older kind of depictions of humans, they're all quite muscular. So when you see someone who's ripped, their body's just ripped, and you're like, how in the hell? Well, actually, biologically, we were like that. 5,000 years ago. That's all our bodies would look like. Women and men look like that. Over time, though, our bodies have changed. And that's, of course, related to our lifestyles. It's related to now we're sitting more, we're more sedentary, but we like that. We like knowing where our food's going to be coming from and knowing that we're going to have food and all of that. So stage 1, we don't really find these, obviously, anymore, but this explains much of human history. But then, as we talked about beforehand, stage 2 is you start to get that first agricultural revolution going. And so you start getting people living together. So you still had a lot of infectious diseases. You have more humans coming in contact with each other. So infectious diseases are still quite prevalent. But a lot of these epidemics and pandemics, the Black Plague, the idea that all these people, whole entire area is being wiped out. How about with Europe, 1 in 3 people died from the plague? That's an example here of huge pandemics and epidemics that just wiped out complete areas. They start to decline. So in those countries today, they're still stage 2. You are seeing this. Infectious diseases are still prevalent. I showed you the data. I showed you the maps that showed that. But globally, what we see is we see a lot of things. A lot of those infectious diseases are receding. If we go back to that chart, there's a lot of negatives. There's those 3 things that were increasing. All of those negatives are examples of infectious diseases declining. So that's because countries and areas transition through these stages. So the agricultural revolution, so the cholera outbreak in the United Kingdom in the 1840s, completely wiped out large amounts of areas, large amounts of people. Today, no one dies of cholera in London, England, because England transitioned through this model. And so, how do you transition from stage 2 to stage 3? How do you, have less infectious diseases as far as killing people? Information helps, but the biggest is this improvements in sanitation. So this is a map that shows sanitation. This is the proportion of the population using improved sanitation facilities. So what that means is green means people that live in green countries are more likely to have plumbing, bathrooms, stuff. They're number 1 and number 2 wastewater treatment facilities. We take that for granted. 100 years ago, the number 1 problem in people's lives was figuring out what to do with their number 1 and number 2, their poo and their pee. What do you do with it? Now we just push a button and bye, it's gone. Don't have to worry about that anymore. So we think about developed countries, stage 4 countries. That ain't a problem. We've already improved our sanitation. But we look at once again those same areas, those same places that are stage 2 countries. We can see they're lagging behind. They're improving, but lagging behind in terms of sanitation. So better sanitary cities and wastewater and infrastructure for sure, but also drinking water. Once again, blue is areas that have high, good clean water, and places that are orange, not so much. And so once again, we can understand why infectious diseases are endemic to certain areas. It's largely tied to sanitation, improvements in technology, awareness, education, and all of that. Now we go to stage 3. So stage 3, we also relate stage 3 to gender equality, so lower birth rates. We also see people moving from rural areas to urban areas in stage 3 in large numbers. So what's happening there is you see decreasing infectious diseases. So less people dying of infectious diseases, more people dying of non-infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, more people dying of heart disease, cancers, instead of malaria, instead of flu, or some type of waterborne disease like diarrhea. So what's happening, though, is an increase in non-infectious diseases. So they kind of go hand in hand, obviously. Decreasing infectious disease, but over more and more of those non-infectious diseases explain why and how people die. Finally, stage 4. Of course, we all want to live longer. There's this guy named Aubrey de Grey. He's a researcher, scientist, and he says there's someone on Earth right now that will live to be 1,000 years old. He says we're there. The technology's there. What he kind of believes is the idea that the human body, the genes, can be manipulated. So he says there's a gene in our body called the aging gene. So if we can essentially turn that gene off, turn that aging gene off, we can stay the same, we're not going to age for the rest of our lives. So obviously we have different ways in which we die. So far out, I mean, when I first heard 1,000 years old, I was thinking, I don't want to be some vegetable. But what he says is actually you'll be able to maintain what you look like. And so this is why he's like, he doesn't eat, because he believes that that's going to increase his life expectancy. He's always bizarre. He eats nothing but like little nuts and little acai berries, or those berries that are supposed to increase longevity. So this guy obviously doesn't want to die. But he thinks that if someone on Earth lives 1,000 years old, he based it on technology. Hey, we got all these different researchers, whether it be Middle East, whether it be South Asia, whether it be Latin America or Africa. All these researchers, they come up with ideas, they share ideas. That's going to then lead to changes. And once again, I mean, if we look at the 20th century, the average Earthling lived to 33 years old. I'd be already dead 3 years ago. Today, we just saw it's over 60. So we can see increasing changes, and he argues that these changes as far as increasing life expectancy is going to increase exponentially. But of course, we've got other things going on, increasing obesity. So when we think about countries transitioning through this model, more countries coming into stage 4. Globally obesity is increasing. We saw that in the data. And so helping to explain why countries and areas are transitioning through these stages, and we see these different characteristics. Any questions about the 4 stages? So let's go ahead, let's apply them to our case study countries we've talked about throughout the book. So the case study countries, and what I've done is, I've already done the, if you've watched those videos, I explained how and why I came up with the demographic transition model stage for each of these. So I have them in ascending order from stage 2, those transitioning 2 to 3, those transitioning 3 to 4, and of course those countries that are stage 4. And so let's look at different characteristics. And so let's start off, of course, communicable deaths. So once again, this is getting redundant, but we can see in our stage 4 countries, communicable deaths, infectious diseases, much less likely to kill people in those stage 2 countries or stage 3 countries. So this is just the data kind of reflecting and kind of carrying on, once again, proving that whole argument that the epidemiologic transition model overlaps the demographic transition model. I guess that's all we get. No, we don't. Then we branch out, look at non-communicable deaths, and then once again proportion of those deaths that are non-communicable. And we saw this essentially, this chart already played itself out, low income, high income. But now we use this, my demographic transition model stages. We see stage 2 versus stage 4. We can see definitely differences in which, how we die. Tuberculosis, we've already talked about TB. We've already talked about cholera. So those we can see are still heavily affected there in stage 2 countries, stage 3 countries. Africa, Latin America, parts of Latin America, and Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and all of that. Oh, there's where we went. Okay. And so here's Associated Press: lung cancer now top cancer killer for women in rich nations. I just saw that headline, kind of was like, relates to stuff we talk about in geography. What do we got here? This is tobacco use. So tobacco use, so now we're trying to understand, okay, well, why are certain cancers maybe more prevalent in certain areas? So we can see, once again, let's look at Africa. Let's look at Central Africa, that place in which we saw infectious diseases, places in which we saw the Ebola virus, but not much lung cancer. That's largely because they don't smoke cigarettes in large numbers. Although, I guarantee you that's increasing. I guarantee you that's increasing. Is it increasing? Cigarette smoking?
Not as much as United States.
Not as much here, yeah, especially in Indiana. Go out to California, New England, people don't smoke as much. But I guarantee you those tobacco companies see Africa as a growing market, and they love it. So I guarantee you cigarettes are making their way there shortly, because they want to increase their profits, especially as restrictions in the United States, prices, taxes, and all that increases on cigarettes. They'll move to a different market. Anyway, emerging Africa is something that's definitely going to characterize the next 10, 15 years for you guys. Africa is going to become a major, more of a player. You know, that where your stuff comes from, you're going to see a lot more stuff made in Africa than other places. It's coming. It's stuff that we can see. It's down the road. Here's alcohol. Another first world problem, a stage 4 problem is alcohol consumption. We can see Russia, man. They're smokers. They're big smokers. They're big drinkers. It makes sense why they have high cardiovascular disease. And so this is cardiovascular disease, heart disease. So we can tie in these risk factors, these behavior characteristics, and also kind of relate that to how people die. So cardiovascular, cancer, you can see those are more likely to be found in stage 4 countries, developed countries. We see those definitely more prevalent. Any questions? Cool, that's all I got.